December 24, 1943, interior Alaska. A man steps out of a failing aircraft at 8,000 feet and falls into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. He has no food, no radio, no compass, no sleeping bag. The temperature on the ground is 40 below zero. The nearest settlement is not near in any human sense. It is an idea, somewhere beyond miles of frozen river and black spruce forest that doesn't know he exists and doesn't care. The parachute opens. Below him, an unbroken wilderness stretches in every direction. Snow covers the country like a shroud. Frozen rivers cut pale lines through the dark forest. No roads, no buildings, no smoke, no human mark of any kind. The aircraft drifts away, carrying 4 men and every piece of equipment that might have made this survivable. Then it disappears. The sound of engines fades, and Leon Crane is alone. What followed was 84 days. To understand what Crane was stepping into, you need to understand what the Alaskan interior actually is. Not the postcard version, not the wilderness retreat version, the real version. At 25,000 feet, the terrain below flattens into an enormous white map, rivers braided like veins, black spruce rising in clusters so dense they look like ink spilled across snow. It is the kind of landscape that deceives pilots because it offers no cues, no towns, no roads, no geometry to suggest scale. The interior of Alaska can swallow a plane as neatly as it swallows a man, and it does not mark the spot afterward. On the ground, in late December, the sun makes a low arc and never gains the warmth of height. Daylight lasts a few hours. The winter solstice had just passed. The Arctic does not offer gentle nights. It delivers long, hard, brutally cold ones, where the temperature drops further after dark, and the silence is so complete it feels staged. Crane was 24 years old, a flight engineer, precise systems-oriented, trained to read instruments and listen to the language of engines. His job was not heroic. It was numbers, tolerances, attention. He was the kind of man who trusted structure, because structure had always worked. The mission out of Ladd Field near Fairbanks was listed as a cold weather test flight, routine, almost bureaucratic. Aircraft were being pushed into conditions that ruined lubricants, warped seals, and frozen control surfaces. The crew was 5 men. They knew the air would be hostile, but they expected hostility in the abstract, something held back by aluminum skin, heated manifolds, and procedure. Then the aircraft began to misbehave. At first it was subtle, the kind of inconsistency that makes a conscientious engineer frown and double-check readings. A control response that lagged half a second too long, a vibration traveling through the airframe like a rumor. The Liberator wasn't a delicate machine. It was built to absorb punishment, but even a rugged bomber had an anatomy of failure, and once failure began, it moved fast. The plane rolled, corrected, rolled again. Then it dropped into a flat spin, not a simple nosedive, where gravity at least points in a comprehensible direction, but a horizontal rotation, the aircraft revolving like a coin on a table, while losing altitude in a widening, sickening spiral. The horizon stopped behaving. Airspeed readings became misleading. Controls went slack. Captain John Sutherland tried everything. Crane heard the tone of his voice change. The clipped urgency that meant fear was being held at bay with authority. At 8,000 feet, the calculation became brutal. The plane might be coaxed into a crash landing, or it might carry them all into the ground, still spinning. Sutherland ordered the crew to bail out. People romanticize parachutes as a kind of last-minute salvation, a calm jump, a drifting descent, maybe even a moment of beauty. The reality is that stepping out of a failing aircraft is a wager, made under pressure, and it is not made in comfort. Some of the crew chose to stay with the aircraft, betting that Sutherland might still wrestle it down. Crane did not. He moved to the hatch. The cold that pushed through the opening struck him like a solid force, not simply low temperature, but something predatory, instantly invasive, burning his lungs and snatching away moisture. He performed the movements he'd practiced. He reached the point where hesitation would be fatal. He jumped. For a few seconds there was only falling, a loud rush of air, and the animal knew that nothing separated him from the ground, except silk and faith in a mechanism. When the parachute snapped open, It did so with violence, yanking his body upright, jerking straps into his shoulders. The shock was clarifying. He was alive. He looked down, because down was everything. Below him, unbroken wilderness, a frozen river cutting through the dark forest. No roads, no buildings, no smoke. The B-24 drifted away in the distance, carrying 4 men and every piece of equipment that would have made his situation survivable. Then it vanished into the white. The sound of its engines faded. With it went the last sign of company. His landing was not graceful. He came down hard into deep snow, impact driving the air from his lungs and burying him to the waist. The cold rose immediately through his boots and legs. When he forced himself upright, he stood in silence so complete it felt staged. It was already afternoon, late December. He had hours, maybe fewer, before darkness dropped and the temperature fell even further. He took stock with the practiced clarity of someone trained to inventory resources in crisis. A small Boy Scout knife, a box of waterproof matches, the clothes on his body, uniform, boots, gloves, the parachute, no food, no compass, no radio, no signal flares, no sleeping bag, no certainty of direction. The nearest settlement was not near. It was an idea. Many men would have died that first night without making a single heroic mistake. Exposure kills quietly. It begins with shivering, then numbness, then a fatigue that feels deceptively like relief. The temptation is to sit down, to stop fighting the cold, and let the body do what it wants. Crane understood enough about hypothermia to fear that temptation. He gathered the parachute and wrapped it around himself, turning silk into insulation. Thin, inadequate compared to proper gear, but it trapped air and slowed heat loss. He burrowed into the snow, using the drift and depression as protection from wind. Snow insulates when you're inside it, not when you're on top of it. He lay there as the sky darkened, listening to the interior grow colder. In the distance, wolves howled, not close enough to be an immediate danger, near enough to remind him that he was not the only hungry creature in this place. Sleep came in fragments. His body shook with violent shivers that burned calories like gasoline. He woke repeatedly, disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was. Then remembering, with a surge of dread, breath iced his beard. The parachute fabric stiffened as moisture froze. He survived the night. That was the first victory, small, unglamorous, and necessary. By morning, his extremities were already in trouble, fingers clumsy, toes numb as if his feet belonged to someone else. Frostbite doesn't arrive like a dramatic injury. It creeps in, a quiet theft, stealing function. Before you notice it's gone. He needed fire, not for comfort, for circulation, for the ability to use his hands, for the possibility of continuing to exist in this place for another day. In the Alaskan interior, fire is not merely warmth, fire is permission. The matches in his pocket suddenly carried the weight of his life. He struck the first one. Wind killed it instantly. The second flared and vanished. The third did the same. 3 small failures, but each one felt enormous, because each one cost him something he could not replace. Panic began pressing at the edges of his mind. Not screaming panic, but a tightening, a sense of time closing in. If he wasted the matches, he would be reduced to primitive friction methods, in sub-zero cold with numb fingers. Nearly impossible. The world would not give him another try. On the 4th attempt, he forced himself to slow down. He found shelter from wind beneath a fallen spruce where branches had created a pocket of relative dryness. He scraped bark, shaved wood into thin curls, built a small nest of tinder. He used his body as a windbreak, crouched low, struck the match with deliberate care. The flame caught the fine shavings. I was trembling, strengthened. When the fire finally stabilized into something more than a fragile flicker, Crane felt a surge of relief, so intense it was nearly dizzying. Heat returned to his fingers with pain, a stabbing sensation that meant blood was moving again. He held his hands near the flames and made a quiet decision. That mattered more than any plan. He would not let the fire go out. He would not die here. For the next few days, he lived on melted snow. Hunger didn't announce itself immediately. It began as an emptiness, then grew into a constant ache that never fully left. In normal conditions, a man can go weeks without food. In the Arctic, hunger is amplified because cold demands energy. Every movement burns calories. Every shiver is an attack on reserves that aren't being replenished. His thoughts began to narrow, an obsessive focus pulling him toward food, the mind trying to drag the body toward survival by force of want. He fashioned snares from parachute cord, knowledge pulled from somewhere distant, Boy Scout lessons learned in childhood and forgotten until the moment. They became the only currency that mattered. He set traps along likely rabbit runs, adjusting placement through observation and failure. His first attempts caught nothing. Each day he checked them, with diminishing hope, because hope itself costs energy when it keeps sending you toward disappointment. On the fourth day, he found a snowshoe hare, caught by the hind leg. He killed it quickly, skinned it with numb fingers, cooked it over the fire. The smell of meat, thin, wild, hit him with an intensity that felt almost obscene after days of nothing. He ate slowly, aware his stomach couldn't handle speed. But it took real discipline not to devour it in seconds. It wasn't a feast. It was simply enough. Enough to keep the engine running. One more day. For a week he stayed near his landing site. He spread parachute silk across the snow to make himself visible from above. Built smoky fires during daylight, feeding them green boughs to create signal plumes. Scanned the sky until his neck ached. Listened for engines until the silence itself felt insulting. No aircraft came. The Alaskan interior is vast in a way that makes search and rescue a gamble. A man on the ground is small, snow erases color, wind smears tracks. Without a radio, without coordinates, without a clear crash site, search becomes a word that describes intention more than outcome. At some point, he couldn't say exactly when, the hope of rescue shifted from a reasonable expectation to a fantasy he could no longer afford. It was not a dramatic moment. It was an internal adjustment, quiet and grim. And once it happened, it freed him. If no one was coming, he had only one option. He had to move. He chose the river, because rivers are the simplest logic in wilderness. Water collects, water moves, people gather near it, trails follow it. Even frozen, a river is a line through chaos, and Crane needed a line. Traveling in deep snow is grinding work. Each step requires lifting the foot high, driving it down, breaking the crust, dragging forward. In that cold, sweat is dangerous. Wet clothing steals heat fast, but moving without sweating requires a controlled pace, which is hard when fear urges haste. Crane learned to walk like a machine, steady, deliberate, conserving energy with the same discipline he'd once used to conserve fuel on long flights. When he stopped, he built fire. When he slept near fire, waking repeatedly to feed it before his body cooled too far. His days became a cycle: gather wood, melt snow, check snares, walk, build shelter, survive the night, then repeat. By day 20, he had lost nearly 30 pounds. His uniform hung loose, his face cracked and blood at the corners of his mouth. His beard grew thick, collecting ice from his breath until it felt like a mask. He developed an economy of motion. No wasted gestures, no unnecessary detours. Every flourish cost warmth and calories he didn't have. The isolation began doing what isolation always does. It didn't merely make him lonely. It altered his mind's relationship to reality. Humans calibrate themselves through other voices, and alone for long enough, a person's thoughts begin to echo, and the echo becomes its own company. Crane started talking aloud. At first it was practical, reciting procedures, giving himself orders the way an officer would. Later it became something else. He spoke to animals he saw, to trees, to the river, to nothing. It wasn't madness, it was an adaptation. The mind invented companionship to keep itself organized in a place where death could arrive. Because you made one tired, stupid mistake, mental clarity was as vital as fire. Nights were the hardest. The temperature dropped further after dark. The darkness stretched. Sometimes the aurora rippled overhead, a green shifting veil that looked almost artificial, too graceful. For such a brutal world, it could be comforting, the suggestion that beauty existed even here. It could also be unsettling, like the sky itself was alive and watching. Around day 35, the river reminded him how quickly hard could become fatal. Crossing what seemed like solid ice, He felt the surface give. Then he was in the water. The shock was so total, it stole his ability to think. Cold water at 40 below doesn't feel cold. It feels like being hit. It triggers a reflex that can drown you if your head goes under, because the body wants to gasp. He fought for the ice edge. It broke away as he grabbed it. He drove his knife into the surface like a pick and dragged himself out inch by inch onto solid ground. Wet clothing at 40 below is not an inconvenience. It is a countdown. His pants began freezing solid. Within minutes, the fabric turning stiff as wood. He stumbled to shore, gathered wood with frantic urgency, built the largest fire he could manage, with hands that barely worked. Then he stripped off the frozen clothes and sat exposed in the Arctic cold, close enough to the flames that heat stung his skin. Watching steam rise from his trousers, he understood with absolute clarity that if the fire failed before the fabric dried, he would die. Not eventually, that afternoon. That moment, naked, shaking, guarding a fire, like it was the most sacred object in the world, etched itself into his memory as the purest distillation of fear. Fear without an enemy, without noise, without anything to fight except time and physics. The fire held. He lived through that day and the days that followed, but his body was changing in ways that couldn't be reversed by rest. Fat reserves vanished. Then my muscles began to go. He grew gaunt. Hunger never left. It only changed texture from acute pain to a steady emptiness that was in some ways worse. Around day 50, the wilderness offered something it had withheld for 7 weeks. Evidence of humans, not a sound, not a mirage, something more reliable, geometry. Straight lines where nature preferred curves. A small log cabin stood among the trees, weathered and silent. For several seconds, Crane simply stared at it, afraid it might dissolve if he approached, afraid his mind had invented it as a cruel trick. But the cabin held its shape. Inside, dust lay thick and undisturbed. But the place contained treasure: a rusty stove, a cache of matches, a can of lard, tins of food, a knife better than his own, and most importantly, a .22 rifle with ammunition. Crane's reaction was not a triumph. It was released. He sat down and cried, the way men sometimes cry when they've been strong too long, not because they're suddenly weak, but because the pressure finally finds a seam. He stayed for days, maybe weeks. He ate carefully, knowing his stomach couldn't handle abundance. After long deprivation, used the rifle to hunt more efficiently, conserving the energy that had been going into trap setting. Warmed himself with the stove until his bones felt less like glass. He searched the cabin and found an old map, faded, not entirely reliable, but it offered something he hadn't had since the jump: orientation. The map suggested he was deep in the upper reaches of Yukon country, far from major settlements, but not beyond the reach of humans. There were outposts downstream, trading posts, camps. Names on paper meant possibility. When he finally left the cabin, he built crude snowshoes from wood and hide, fashioned a small sled to drag supplies rather than carry them. Travel became marginally less punishing. He was still alone, still thin, still deep in a wilderness that had been trying to kill him for 7 weeks. But he had proof that humans existed out here, that the land was not an unbroken void. By day 70, he had covered well over 100 miles. His body was a ledger of loss. His mind fought a constant negotiation between hope and exhaustion. He managed the scale of the journey, the only way anyone manages something too large to comprehend. He reduced it not hundreds of miles, just the next bend in the river, the next patch of dry wood, the next night. Survived, move, rest, survive, repeated until it became less a strategy than a mechanical truth. On day 84, the wilderness offered one final form of geometry: tracks. Not animal tracks, those he could now read as casually as a city man reads street signs. Human tracks, recently, sharp edge, purposeful. He stood still for a moment, afraid to breathe, afraid the evidence would vanish if he moved too fast. Then he followed. The tracks led to a bend in the river, and beyond it, smoke rising through the trees, a small camp. And around it, people. Athabascan trappers, living with the quiet competence of those who understood this land, not as a hostile mystery, but as home. Crane approached slowly. He must have looked like something pulled from a nightmare, skeletal, bearded, wearing a mixture of tattered uniform and improvised clothing, eyes bright with a desperation that can frighten even kind people. He called out, his voice cracked raw from weeks of disuse. The trappers startled. Then they recognized immediately what he was, a man at the edge. They brought him in, fed him, warmed him, and in that first moment of human contact, after 84 days alone, Crane's control broke completely. He cried openly, not because he wanted to, but because the body sometimes releases emotion, the way it releases shivers, involuntary, necessary. After so long alone, the presence of other people felt unreal, like waking from a fever dream into a room with light. When Crane arrived in Fairbanks, the medical staff was stunned by the numbers. He had dropped from around 180 pounds to 115. Frostbite marked him, but remarkably, he had not lost fingers or toes. Malnutrition had thinned him, weakened him, caused deficiencies that would take months to correct. He was alive after 84 days alone, in conditions that kill quickly and without fanfare. Military officials interviewed him. At length, the Arctic was not forgiving of ignorance, and men were going to keep flying over it. Crane's experience, brutal as it was, became a kind of field manual, written in scars and memory. What to do, what not to do, what the difference between those two things actually costs. He was offered a discharge. He refused it. When asked why, he answered with the logic of someone who had done the math and liked his odds. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Later, back in civilian life in Philadelphia, he rarely spoke about it. He married, I had children, I worked as an engineer, built a life that extended decades beyond those 84 days. When pressed, he downplayed what he'd done the way many of his generation did. They did not think of endurance as exceptional. They thought of it as necessary. Somewhere along the Charlie River, the wreckage of the B-24 Liberator still lies scattered across tundra and trees. In 1991, nearly 50 years after the crash, the remains were finally located and documented. Among the artifacts recovered was a watch, frozen at the exact moment the aircraft met the ground. A small mechanical witness to the second gravity finished the argument. The other 4 men were never recovered. Their names exist in records, in family stories, and in the quiet grief of a war that scattered loss across the world without asking anyone's permission. Crane lived until 2002. He was 83 years old. That fact, more than anything else, is the real measure of what happened out there. The wilderness tried to reduce him to a footnote. He declined. He did not defeat Alaska. No one defeats a place like that. The cold doesn't care. The forest doesn't care. The river doesn't care. They were there before he arrived, and they continued after he left, unchanged, indifferent, waiting for the next person, foolish or unlucky enough, to test them. What Crane did was simpler and harder than defeat. He survived it long enough to reach other people, to step back into the human world, to keep living. And if you strip away the romance and the retelling, what remains is the quiet truth at the center of the story. The truth Crane himself pointed to. Whenever someone tried to call him a hero, the moment you decide you're going to die, you do. He never made that decision. Not on the ground that first night, not when the matches were running out, not when he fell through the ice, not when the hunger got bad enough to narrow his vision to a single mouthful. Not across 84 days of cold and silence and the particular madness of being truly, completely alone. He kept making the other decision instead, the small one, the unglamorous one, the one that had to be made again every single morning to do the next thing, gather the wood, feed the flame, take the next step. That decision, repeated 84 days in a row, is what brought him home.